Hi, welcome to InSync, the podcast that explores the history and impact of some of your favorite music moments in TV and film. I'm your host, Rachel Brodsky.
And I'm just looking for the microprocesses.
Martin Scorsese's 2006 crime thriller epic, The Departed, is a bleak portrait of post-9/11 Boston, a blatantly racist and xenophobic mishmash where cops pose as bad guys and bad guys pose as cops.
Loosely based on the real-life Winter Hill Gang, The Departed features a 2000s Hollywood who's who cast. We've got Leo DiCaprio, Matt Damon, Jack Nicholson, and Mark Wahlberg, with Martin Sheen, Ray Winstone, Vera Farmiga, Alec Baldwin, Anthony Anderson, James Badge Dale, all in supporting roles.
In one of the movie's opening montages, where charming yet ultra-violent Irish crime boss Jack Nicholson, aka Frank Costello, introduces himself to a young Colin Sullivan, later played by Matt Damon, in the 80s, we hear the Rolling Stones' 1969 war protest anthem featuring Mary Clayton, Gimme Shelter.
Scorsese sure does love a Gimme Shelter gangster movie needle drop. He's used it 3 times, first in Goodfellas, then again in 1995's Casino, and of course, 3 different times in The Departed.
So why does Gimme Shelter lend itself so well to organized crime dramas? And which Celtic-loving Boston punk band gets the second best or first, depending on who's asking, needle drop in The Departed?
All that and more on this episode of InSync.
I'm the guy who does his job. You must be the other guy.
First, before we jump into this week's episode, a little bit of housekeeping. We are going to be off next week, just for 1 week. We're going to skip a week before our season 2 finale, which will air on the 9th of July. And it's just so we can line up possibly with the release of a new thing that we are going to definitely want to talk about.
Yeah, we need to take a deep breath, get our ducks or bears, as it were, in a row. And then we'll see you in like a week. But again, season 2 finale airs July 9th.
And if you thought that Rachel's Boston accent was great, you got to wait till you hear her Chicago accent.
It's not bad for someone who's only been to Boston, I think 3 times grand total.
Pretty good.
And all 4 were just like, well, I have to admit, after watching The Departed, I was my brain was thinking in a Boston accent.
Oh, yeah. It's very easy to tell who is legitimate and who is not legitimate.
You would know better than I.
Oh, yeah.
You spent many years in Boston.
And
you
of
went
course,
to college.
My wife,
college in Boston.
I did, and grad school. And my wife is from Boston, from Somerville. And anytime there is someone who is pretending to be from Boston on a show, she will lean over to me and go, they're not really from Boston. To the point that I think we could probably share this now. Leanne is my wife is a background voice in the Boston Strangler movie. She's just like in what's called the Loop Group, where you can kind of hear her voice in the background. And she got it because she is like actually can have a Boston accent. And she recorded the audition for that in your studio.
Yeah, for those who may have forgotten, Aviv and I are neighbors. We live in the same building. We don't just live in each other's houses. I realize, because I think it's been a minute since we mentioned
live in each other's houses.
We live in the same collective house.
Yes,
but we are neighbors, and that's how we met, and that's how we came to launch your favorite podcast
show.
InSync. Yeah.
And we also have some listener feedback. We don't read listener feedback on the air very often, but this one I think is worth a read.
Yeah. So this email is from our only listener, Charles Brodsky, my dad, who
Happy Father's Day.
Right. We're recording this on Father's Day, and I thought I wanted to read his feedback to our perfect episode, which aired a couple of episodes ago. If you haven't listened to it, please do. It's one of my favorite episodes that we recorded all season.
And it features recurring guest Eleanor Kagan, whose birthday it is today.
So this is meant to be then.
Meant to be.
Happy birthday, Eleanor, and happy
birthday,
Father's
Eleanor.
Day.
Happy Father's Day.
All right, this is the email coming in from my dad, who, by the way, is a really funny writer. It's a little known fact about him, and I feel like he likes to engage with my content just to sort of like remind me what a great writer he is.
He's like a troll.
And like where I got it from. So here it is. Hey, I'm enjoying listening to the Perfect Podcast. I'm especially amused by the collective ignorance of 80s culture that was perhaps imperfectly reflected in the movie. Which I take umbrage a little bit, because I do think that if you listen to the whole episode, this is me, by the way, not my dad. I do think that I think we got our heads around 80s culture like relatively well for people who like didn't experience it, but I'm going to leave that aside. Here's the rest of Dad's email. Disclaimer, I have not seen the movie since when it came out, and I assumed it was pretty superficial, and it was just another attempt to monetize the aerobics craze that had overtaken the country during that decade. That said, I have enjoyed ogling Jamie Lee in her costume. I mean, who doesn't? Who hasn't? From my perspective, this is Dad, two cultural phenomena can best describe the decade in question: conspicuous consumption, yuppies, and the sexualization of fitness, aerobics. Having lived through the decade, none of this is news to me. Perfect is, I guess, something of a Rosetta Stone for the second one, so it's really funny that none of you guys had ever heard of it. I will say that the subtext of government conspiracies to silence or discredit the characters is somewhat anachronistic. Evil government was more of a cultural phenomenon of the 70s, thanks to Vietnam and Watergate. Literally dozens of movies drew from this. By the 80s, nobody feared or mistrusted government anymore, as they were more concerned about buying that first BMW and getting laid.
We all loved Ronald Reagan. I think that that's a really interesting take. I don't necessarily agree that mistrust of the government completely went away in the 80s. There's even a John Travolta movie from 1981 or 2 called Blowout, Brian De Palma movie, which is like really good and circles around like partially a government conspiracy to silence someone who has information about like a state senator or something.
Right. Well, government conspiracy stuff has never really gone away. It was just less overarching and like less mainstream is what I guess he was trying to say.
And we had these like government conspiracy thrillers in the 70s that we didn't really have for a while, and I think they're coming back a little bit in a different way. They came back really big in the 90s, like with Enemy of the State and stuff like that. But yeah, I think the idea that Perfect is a Rosetta Stone of both consumerism and like horny workout stuff is like absolutely spot on.
Nail, meat, head.
Yes.
Yeah. I enjoyed getting this email so much. I just can't overstate.
My mom doesn't write emails about our show. She just tells me that I'm wrong on bi-weekly phone calls.
Sometimes I get a text if it's a quick thought, if it's a more drawn out response email, but this is the only email I think I've gotten. I look forward to more from Dad because, again, great writer, always has a good take. It reminds me of where I came from and why I got into this line of work. I wonder where this all came from. But yeah, thank you, Dad. Happy Father's Day.
Happy Father's Day. And happy Father's Day to my father, who doesn't listen. But that's okay. If we do an Apocalypse Now episode, he'll listen. So today, we're not talking about Apocalypse Now. We are talking about the 2006 film, The Departed. And it's tough for me to find a place to start talking about this film. Martin Scorsese's 21st, by my count, narrative feature film, and yet his only one to win him Academy Award for Best Director, his only one to take home Best Picture. Justice for all of my Aviator stands out there.
Yeah, I feel like The Aviator's kind of been a bit forgotten.
I think that's his best movie, but
I love The Aviator. I saw it in theaters, I think, Aviator. And I've seen it since then and thought, why did I forget what a great movie this is?
I referenced it in my wedding vows. The Departed is the first remake of a foreign language film to ever win Best Picture, one of 2 ever. Scorsese's highest grossing film in the US and his third use of the Rolling Stones song Gimme Shelter. Also, his third collaboration with his Gen X muse, Leonardo DiCaprio. But when I think of The Departed, I think about how absolutely insufferable the city of Boston is when there's a movie.
Oh
made
my
there.
God. I just thought, I think I had a minute in high school where I thought it would be cool to go to college in Boston, which
It was.
Which it is. Like, college is Boston is the college town, and I'm not trying to dispute
Sure
that. But most people that I knew in New York, which is like basically just media circles, had gone to school in Boston, and then like the second they graduated, moved south to New York.
That is the story.
And stayed. And having been to Boston, like, I am like it's not a fair for me. It's just like it's not fair for me to even talk about it, which I'm doing, and I acknowledge it's not fair, because I've lived in too many big cities like New York, LA, San Francisco, and when I go to Boston, I'm just like, this isn't a city.
Oh, geez. Well, I think that so there's obviously a huge rivalry between Boston and New York that kind of plays out like that Don Draper meme.
Yeah.
I feel sorry for you. And he's like, I don't think about you at all.
Yeah.
like Boston has this huge chip on its shoulder about.
It is the chip on the shoulder.
Yeah.
Of the nation.
Yeah,
of the nation. Yeah.
It has a chip on its shoulder about not being as like recognized as some of the other major cities on the East Coast. Unlike my home city of Philadelphia, who seems pretty content to have 12 Monkeys and the Mannequin movies, and I don't know, the birthplace of democracy. Bostonians have always clung to media that takes place there as some sort of validation that they matter too. And so Good Will Hunting was real big for Boston. And to be honest, it still very much is.
Good movie.
Great movie.
Good Will Hunting.
Great Will Hunting. Good Will Hunting 2, hunting season.
Yes.
And when I moved there in the fall of 2004 for college, the movie on every college-aged boy's lips was The Boondock Saints.
Oh, God.
A 1999 movie about two Irish Catholic brothers who become vigilantes and wipe out Boston's criminal underworld in the name of God. It stars Sean Patrick Flannery, Willem Dafoe, and Norman Reedus from The Walking Dead. That film is not good. And it also has its own sordid Hollywood making-of story, but it captured the imagination of Bostonian dudes, mostly, for 7 years until the fall of 2006, when Scorsese blessed us with the truest Bostonist film of all time, at least until Ben Affleck's The Town 4 years later.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned The Town, because for a while I truly confused The Town with
And The Departed.
Yeah, because I thought,
why? How could you do such a thing?
I was like, because I hadn't seen either of them, and I'm not the target audience. I'm just not.
Sure.
And
they are also rather similar.
But I do remember when The Town came out, the trailer starred a then rising vis-a-vis Gossip Girl Blake Lively, and
whose accent is pretty good.
I think she's underrated as an actor.
I was just saying her Boston accent.
Yeah.
This is just based on Boston accent accuracy.
Okay. And as I hit play on The Departed, I thought, is this the one with Blake Lively? No, wait, It can't be, because it's 2006. It's too early. She's still in her traveling pants era.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that both movies are good. I think that The Departed is better. So I saw it in the theater, like days before my 21st birthday. The lights dim. Warner Brothers Pictures presents. And within the first minute, we have the familiar jangle of Gimme Shelter over some archival footage of busing protests in Boston in the 70s, which is one of the more truly fucked up parts of the city's history. And then we meet Frank Costello, played by Jack Nicholson, who traipses into a diner, shakes down the owner, and sexually harasses the waitress who I briefly dated in high school.
No, you didn't. Really?
I did, yes. Her name's Amanda.
Oh my God. Hi, Amanda.
Hi, Amanda. So I didn't know that she was in the movie, and reached out to her on Facebook and was like, are you in The Departed? She's like, yup. I
do that to a musician friend of mine every now and then, who she she does commercials, and every now and then it's like how she pays to also like make music and live.
Sure.
And every now and then, but she looks so different in every commercial. And one time I think I screen capped like the Marshalls ad that I saw her in and was like, is this you grabbing that purse? And she like kind of sent me like a winky face.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
This was my first experience with like seeing someone I knew interact with Jack Nicholson. So it was pretty flabbergasting, but that's a me thing. Costello then puts a young kid named Colin Sullivan, who eventually is played by Matt Damon, in his pocket by buying him groceries for his family. Colin lives with his grandparents. He's an orphan. So Costello plays Artful Dodger, keeping Colin out of the gutter. And interestingly enough, Gimme Shelter gives way to like a diegetic track in the diner and then returns over the montage of Costello grooming Colin to be in his service. And this will turn out to be the crux of the movie. Colin grows up to be a Massachusetts state trooper and part of a task force that aims to bring down Frank Costello, all the while working for Costello's mob front. To contrast this, Leonardo DiCaprio's William Costigan, so we have Costigan and Costello. Thanks a lot.
Costigan,
Colin, and Costello. Costigan, whose late father was, by all accounts, uncorruptible, is also a state trooper, and soon after graduation is handpicked by his captain Queenan to go undercover and spend some time in jail to infiltrate the Costello crime syndicate. So we've got 2 moles, 2 rotten organizations, 2 Rolling Stone needle drops within the first 18 minutes of the film. And then 18 minutes in, a really jarring Dropkick Murphys cue as Billy Costigan goes to jail, and we finally get our title card, The Departed.
There's like a whole movie that plays before we even get the title card.
So this is like a very so much I want to talk about. Movies shot on film are shot in 20-minute increments or projected in 20-minute increments. They're called reels.
Mm-hmm.
And so there used to be all these 2-reeler films, which were 40-minute films. If you've ever seen Fight Club and you know that speech that Brad Pitt gives about the cigarette burns in the corner of the screen to let the projectionist know that they need to change over the film, happens about every 20 minutes. So the cut to title in The Departed is like the end of the first reel of the film, which is like a really interesting choice to play out the whole it's like the first 2 sequences without the title card.
Film lesson of the day.
Film history.
Yeah, film history.
Yeah. The Departed is based on Hong Kong action film series Infernal Affairs, which stars the great Tony Leung and had 3 installments by the time screenwriter William Monahan, writer of Kingdom of Heaven, adapted the first and a tiny bit of the second Infernal Affairs movies into the screenplay for The Departed. Do we want to talk a little bit about how both of these needle drops, Gimme Shelter and I'm Shipping Up to Boston, are used in this film? Because both are really unconventional.
Yes, I would love to know why. Why are they unconventional? Like, why are these needle drops unconventional in terms of the way that you might normally hear songs? Is it that with Gimme Shelter you hear it like multiple times?
Yeah. I think so. Right. It feels there's like a weird like clumsiness to it. So we open with Gimme Shelter over the archival footage, and it continues through this scene with my high school friend Amanda, and then there's this like kind of jarring crossfade to a different song, which feels a little clumsy, and then Gimme Shelter comes back in as if the diegesis of the scene was just like a speed bump in the whole opening montage of the film.
Can I do like a deep read as to
Please.
Why? Well, my main takeaway from The Departed, other than that, as I said to Taylor while we were watching, and probably you too, is that it's just penises gone wild.
Penis.
And my main takeaway is that there's like such an overlap in the Venn diagram between law and crime.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like one's fading out and one's fading in and one's fading out. And it's really hard. You have to keep reminding yourself who is in whose pocket and who is working for whom. And It's that was kind of like what I kept thinking about, just the inextricable connectivity between these two ostensibly separate
I
orcs.
think that's exactly right.
And that's kind of why, and that's the overarching theme. And so I kind of like, if something is moving in and out like the way you just described with the diegesis of Gimme Shelter, that's my take as to why that might be.
I think that reading is completely right. And like at certain points, like, are there any cops that aren't in Costello's pocket? Are there any mobsters that aren't also working for the cops? It's like a really interesting, that overlap. And then I'm Shipping Up to Boston has like a similar thing where it fades up slow. So Queenan, played by Martin Sheen, and Dignam, who is like the only non-crooked cop in the whole movie.
Yeah, and ironically, the biggest, the openly the biggest dick.
Yes,
just like he won't answer a question, any question asked. He just has to insinuate
fucking your mother,
like why he's fucked your mother. Yeah.
So they like convince William Costigan to go to like give up basically his entire life, go to jail, and have his identity essentially erased in order to infiltrate the mob. And the question is, do you want to be a cop or do you want to look like you're a cop? Right? And I think that is the central difference between Costigan and Colin Sullivan, who desperately wants to look like a cop. And so finally he agrees, I'm going to go do it. And we have the slow fade up of I'm Shipping Up to Boston. And then we cut to Costigan in prison doing like tricep push-ups. But as we cut, the volume of the music jacks up by like 15 decibels, right? So it is both a fade up and this like weird hard cut, as though this music is coming from somewhere in the prison as well. It's super, super interesting.
Yeah, I loved the moment just because it just bashes you over the head with sound.
Yeah.
And I mean, I haven't been to prison, but one can assume that it's jarring to the core, especially if you have been a mostly law-abiding citizen, and then you're just thrown in the deep end the way that Leo's character is, right?
And the cut to title becomes pretty breathtaking in that moment, because we can talk a lot about Thelma Schoonmaker's editing is like super propulsive even in moments that like don't require it. And this is like an example of like a really propulsive moment where we have this generally not benign, but like a pretty standard conversation between three people in an office, and then you're like rocketed into prison with this really hard music, and then you get your title card. But the fade up of the music versus the hard cut is like a super interesting choice that I don't know. I wonder if they tried it the other way and were like, oh, this is too jarring, or this is less jarring in some way, which I can imagine. Yeah, it's super, super interesting. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the Dropkick Murphys and their contribution to this film and to Boston history a little later. But I wanted to give a little bit of a background of like why Boston. Scorsese's known for being like a New York guy, so much so that he contributed a short film to the collection New York Stories, a short film that I was forced to watch in film school, and has an incessant needle drop of Procol Harum's Whiter Shade of Pale. Is that how you pronounce their name? I've never said their name.
I've also never said their name that I can recall. So
frankly, I thought this was a Van Morrison song until today. And so why Boston? It's because Scorsese and screenwriter William Monahan saw a real life connection between this mob boss with ties to the cops in The Departed and Infernal Affairs and the infamous Boston gangster Whitey Bulger.
I mean, when I'm thinking about, so without having seen Goodfellas.
Sure.
Or what's the other one?
Casino. Yeah.
I can only say that I imagine that a crime versus law type of juxtaposition is much more cramped and uncozy than it would be like in Boston than it would be in New York, because Boston is like a small town and everyone knows you and you can't get lost, and there are so many moments. Maybe I'm getting a little off topic, but there are so many moments
exactly right,
where Matt Damon and Leo DiCaprio like barely just miss each other, and they're only really in the same scenes after the denouement, and then they like the tension's kind of been released, and then they're like actually speaking to one another. But beforehand, when they're deep undercover, they're constantly just missing each other. And in New York, that would be a lot less likely to happen.
Yeah, there is like an interesting sort of small town feel of everyone knows everyone's business. Costello walks into the diner, recognizes Colin, and is like, you live with your grandparents, you do this, you do that. Same with when he meets Billy Costigan for the first time, and he's like, oh, you're Will Costigan's son. He would kill me if he saw me talking to you. He'd go through 7 of my guys and he could do it, which I think is like a really interesting kind of shared history between these characters that we don't ever see on screen, but William Costigan Sr. was like not someone to be trifled with and seemingly like completely uncorruptible, which I also think is like the idea of the father figure, even though both of their fathers are dead and Frank Costello is a surrogate father for both characters. The fact that Colin Sullivan doesn't have a father didn't have a father as a kid and was easily corruptible because of it, versus Billy Costigan, who his father like instilled in him these morals or whatever. Like Frank Costello, Whitey Bulger was from South Boston, specifically the Southie Projects. This is from Collider. Eventually, he became the Winter Hill gang leader in Boston and found his way on the FBI most wanted list. Ironically, his brother William Bulger would go in the opposite direction, becoming part of the Massachusetts State Senate, president of the University of Massachusetts, and an attorney. So Whitey and Billy Bulger had this sort of connection, and Billy Bulger was like, I don't want to say accused, but like there were implications that he was like pulling strings for Whitey. Whether or not those are substantiated, I don't know. Whitey's life of crime began in his teenage years with street gangs. He was arrested multiple times. He was in the Air Force. And the only reason I'm talking about his like past is because when he was he served 9 years
of a 20-year
sentence for bank robbery. He served it at Alcatraz, and while serving the sentence, he was an unwitting participant in the MK Ultra project, which is the same experimentation that they did on the Unabomber.
What was that project?
So MK Ultra was a project by the CIA to. This is like I'm gonna sound like an absolute crazy person. But this is all completely real. The CIA was trying to work on like mind control experiments with psychotropic drugs, and so they gave students, like psychology students and inmates and people who were infirmed, they like dosed them with LSD and things like that to see like what kind of drug cocktail would make them mind controllable. And so Whitey Bulger was a victim of that, and Ted Kaczynski. So like that makes a lot more, the Unabomber makes a lot more sense when you realize that he was experimented on by the CIA.
Well, if it isn't the consequences of our actions.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not going to say that the Unabomber did nothing wrong.
Right. But they are a contributing factor or two.
I also wouldn't trust the government.
Well, yeah. Or maybe have a bone to pick.
Yeah. Whitey Bulger was also directly represented on screen by Johnny Depp in Black Mass, which is an absolutely horrible movie. But the way that Bulger and Costello are connected through The Departed, not just because of their associations with the Boston crime underworld, was that they were both secretly cooperating with the FBI and selling out their associates. Eventually, Bulger went on the run in 1994, and there was a massive manhunt. And the first confirmed sighting of him was in London in 2002 because of a different movie.
Because of a different movie.
Because of a different movie. So a businessman in London was watching the movie Hannibal, and Hannibal deals with Clarice Starling in the FBI. And so there is like a most wanted list in the background of this FBI, like, you know, plus Hannibal Lecter. And this businessman recognized Whitey Bulger from the movie. Huh. This led a worldwide manhunt. FBI agents were sent to Uruguay. Some agents were sent to stake out the 60th anniversary of celebrations of the Battle of Normandy because Bulger was an enthusiastic fan of military history. And then a report from an off-duty Boston police officer was confirmed that they saw Whitey Bulger after a San Diego screening of The Departed. So this led to a search in Southern California for a few weeks in 2006, but Whitey was in Southern California. And in 2011, authorities received a tip from a woman in Iceland that Bulger was living in an apartment near the beach in Santa Monica. And the Boston Globe identified this tipster as Anna Bjornsdottir, who was a former model and actress and Miss Iceland 1974. And she just lived in Whitey's neighborhood. A day later, they used a ruse, agents and other task force members to lure Whitey out of his apartment, and then they arrested him. He was incarcerated. He was found guilty of a bunch of different murders and crimes, and was incarcerated. And then in 2018, on October 30th, 89 years old, he was found dead in his cell. He was in a wheelchair and had been beaten to death by multiple inmates, armed with a sock-wrapped padlock and shiv. And his eyes had nearly been gouged out, and his tongue was almost cut off.
Oh my.
They don't know
poetic justice.
Yeah, right. So like clearly you don't cut off someone's tongue unless they're
a rat.
Like a rat. But a law enforcement official described Bulger as unrecognizable. So like, I'll put my tinfoil hat back on. Was it Whitey?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So this is the character that the Frank Costello character is based on. And apparently Whitey was disgusted by Nicholson's portrayal of Frank Costello in The Departed, specifically because Costello was a rat, and being a rat was the worst thing that could ever happen. But I have to stress, Bulger was a rat.
Right. Well, you know how with certain extreme personalities, they like narcissists and sociopaths, being called out in any way tends to elicit strong, angry reactions.
Well, if it isn't the consequences of my actions.
A little bit of that going on.
He also did have this like strong narcissistic personality in that he was very charismatic, and he actually had to he got like a prison psychologist fired because he like made the prison psychologist feel really bad for him and allowed Whitey to like use a cell phone because he felt like he was this victim of the MK Ultra experiments and other circumstances of his upbringing. And so the prison officials found out that Whitey was essentially manipulating this therapist and fired the therapist.
My God.
Incredible.
I mean, to be fair, that's a bad therapist.
That is absolutely a bad therapist. But it's very interesting that, like, as we talk about, like, the Venn diagram of corrupt cops versus cops in the crime world, there's also this really interesting Venn diagram of, like, the plot of Infernal Affairs, which is basically the plot of The Departed, that kind of fits perfectly over this Whitey Bulger narrative that is, like, in Boston's DNA. Everybody's got a cousin who worked for Whitey back in the day.
Oh my God, that is so Boston. I don't have to even be from there to just know. I mean, I've heard enough because as you know, Taylor, my husband, he lived there for about 15 or so years, long enough to get to a perfect Boston accent, although he could probably he's especially good at accents and mimicking. But he's so when we talk about his time in Boston, because we've been back since, now we're in LA, and having been back since, he has that feeling of like when you go back home, it's always smaller than you remember it being. I think
there's more Starbuckses.
Yeah, I think he feels that in a pretty visceral way when it comes to Boston. But from his perspective, coming to Boston from North Carolina, Boston seemed like a really
big city. Yeah.
Which I totally get.
I also think that the DNA of Boston has changed significantly since the late 90s, early 2000s, and the world of this movie versus the world of Boston now, because Boston is very tech money heavy now.
Right.
And so a lot of these like really shady areas, they don't exist anymore.
Right. They've all been okay, so this is
sanitized.
This is a silly, please don't judge me for this reference, but I think I was watching Married at First Sight. Boston. I really enjoy Married at First Sight. The episodes are way too long, but this is where Love Is Blind came from, listeners. It's the same production company. Married at First Sight had a Boston season, and I think one of the contestants, or one of the recently married contestants, was talking about like, this is where my family's house is, and I don't think he said it, but I think Taylor might have said something like, "Oh wow, like that neighborhood looks completely different than I remember it being."
This is also like very much part of the plot of the movie, that during the first instance of Gimme Shelter, Costello is talking in voiceover about how the city of Boston has changed and how America has changed, where like 20 years ago, or however many years ago, he said, an Irish person couldn't get a job, and now we're in the White House. Right?
Yeah. Wait, can I really quickly tell you my favorite line in the whole movie?
She fell funny.
Yeah, that's a good one. The bodega owner, who's like, "I don't understand you Americans. You all hate each other." I'm paraphrasing, of course, but I was like, wow, that one hit, and that is true.
This movie is like way funnier than you would expect.
Yeah.
Upon getting like a Scorsese gangster movie. I also go back and forth between Scorsese and Scorsese. The cranberry juice bit is very funny.
Yeah. What, you on your period?
The "you're a cop" thing is a really fun laugh line that then gets paid off, because I think both of them are actually cops. But before we dive headfirst into Gimme Shelter, I know that we're like Boston right now, but I want to talk about Shipping Up to Boston by the Dropkick Murphys, which is now the kind of the unofficial anthem of the city. With lyrics by Woody Guthrie. So it turns out that Ken Casey, the singer and mostly lyricist of Dropkick Murphys, was looking through Woody Guthrie archives, and he had done that with a previous Dropkick song, "Gonna Be a Blackout Tonight," from the 2003 album Blackout. But this is like credited to Woody Guthrie.
Woody Guthrie shows up in the unlikeliest of places.
So weird.
A lot of his songs still resonate.
Yeah, it's and this is like, it was just a poem about a sailor who lost a leg climbing up the top sail. I mean, there aren't a ton of lyrics in this song, but it was released on a Hellcat Records compilation in 2004, and then re-recorded for the Murphys' 2005 record, The Warrior's Code, which is the version that's in the film. And another music video was released as a tie-in for the film, and it's by far the Murphys' most popular song to date. And I, once again, lived in Boston for 8 years, saw the Dropkick Murphys 7 times in 6 days once, because I worked at the House of Blues.
Okay, yep, there you go.
Every St. Patrick's week, they do 7 shows in 6 days, 2 on the actual St. Patrick's Day. And seeing them is weird.
Why?
This was in 2009. So it wasn't too far after The Departed, and they are a union, working class, good bunch of dudes. I met there. I met a few of them working with them. They're good dudes. And yet there were cops from New York, like people like NYPD officers who took the bus or drove up to Boston to see the Dropkicks on St. Patrick's Day, throwing their badges onto the stage.
I love that. That must have been fun. I have not seen Dropkick Murphys live in that way.
Yeah.
However, I saw them in a more intimate way in New York. Sort of the inversion of what you saw. But when I briefly worked at Paste magazine in 2016, 2017, we were starting to play around with live Facebook performances, live stream Facebook performances that we would then move on over to YouTube, and it might still be there. Where a band would play a song, someone would interview them, and then they play another song. But one of the first bands that we had in the studio was Dropkick Murphys, or at least a few of them. And
there's like 7 of them.
Yeah, there are a lot of members, and I met the main one whose name escapes me.
Ken,
yeah. And I remember he sat in my office with me, and we just talked for a while, and it was exactly as you described. It was just very chill and
good ass dudes. Yeah,
just a good ass dude. And I was probably more of a Dropkick, like an active Dropkick Murphys fan, because I was such a punk. I was just a little mall punk in high school. And although they kind of came second to Flogging Molly for me, I was more of a Flogging Molly girl.
But living in Boston for so long, I had mentioned a few episodes ago that Michelle Nolan DeRosa was my neighbor. Her husband, Jeff DeRosa, is in the Dropkick Murphys and, is their banjo player. But they also had, at least at the time, this road manager whose name was Throat. And Throat got the name because he had like no larynx and would talk like that.
We're just gonna talk. We're just gonna name you what you don't have. Yeah.
Which is also like a very Boston thing. It's like, oh, you talk weird? Your name's Throat now.
Yeah. Yeah.
I credit Scorsese and the music supervisor on basically all of his movies, who there's like a huge music department on The Departed, but he does find these really interesting, like lesser known tracks. And he gets this bad rep for being like, oh, only gangster movies and only Rolling Stones. And that's not really the case. Specifically, like, we talked a little bit about this before we started recording. There's like a Me First and the Gimme Gimmes Beach Boys cover in The Wolf of Wall Street. Like, who is looking for these songs? There isn't a specific music supervisor listed for The Departed. And I have a feeling that Scorsese has like a really close eye on the music that's in his movies. But like, it's super interesting that he finds these absolutely weirdo deep cuts, including Badfinger's Baby Blue, like 9 years before it became the final song in Breaking Bad.
Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't realize that at all. But I remember being, like going through the movie, there were a few obvious picks.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's some Allman Brothers, right?
Yeah. And there's John Lennon, there's Patsy Cline.
But then there's like a Nas song.
Nas, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And
Great.
I wonder if that is to create a dichotomy between like the old world and the new world. Maybe we could talk a little bit more about that after we finally get into Gimme Shelter.
Yeah. Well, so it just so happens that while we were texting, I was listening to some background, like a behind the song about Gimme Shelter. Ooh. And it did. So I was under the impression at first that this was just like a protest war song, but right. It's actually way more layered than that. So Gimme Shelter, at least the riff, started with, and the name started when Keith Richards, I believe, was like waiting in an airport and thinking about his girlfriend, who was starring in a movie alongside Mick Jagger, his bandmate, and feeling, I think, kind of anxious that there's going to be some physical, act like a love scene between Mick and his girlfriend, and
famously like sex symbol Mick Jagger,
right? And in fact, there was a love scene, and it was a very sexual movie, apparently. And well, some people allege that the love scene wasn't faked or simulated. It was real, although the girlfriend maintained that it was simulated. Anyhow, so we're kind of like laying the groundwork for where Keith Richards' mind is. And then he's watching, and then there's he's looking out the window at this airport, and then there's this huge downpour. People start running and looking like literally for shelter. That's kind of the beginning of like the riff.
Like downpour of rain.
Downpour of rain.
Yeah.
Okay. So weather is happening, and this is all before Mick comes in and really like fills out the lyrics. So lyrically, Mick is thinking about, it's actually not a totally dissimilar atmosphere in terms of global events than we're currently living in, which is a lot of unprecedented things are happening. And this is like taking place in like 1968, where a lot of end of innocence type events happen. Martin Luther King is killed.
Bobby Kennedy is also killed in 1968, I think.
Right. Bobby Kennedy is assassinated. We're entering, well, we've been in the war in Vietnam, but the war in Vietnam is really picking up. It's not a popular war. There's racial unrest. It's just a very, very historically bad time in the world at large, really. It feels very concentrated probably in the Western hemisphere, in the US and the UK. That feeling of kind of being on the precipice of total chaos and anarchy is really like is the fuel to Gimme Shelter.
And that has like a super interesting, there is this like super interesting, ominous feeling to the riff.
Yeah, especially at the beginning, it feels like chills are starting to percolate, like on your arms and down your spine, and the way the way that it begins to sort of creep in, it's like you want to look over your shoulder.
Yeah, and it's got like it's like an interesting kind of repetitive down the scale sort of rhythm guitar, and then like Keith Richards just kind of noodling in a way that if it were any other guitarist than Keith Richards, it would be like kind of obnoxious. But he's just got this perfect vibe of, yes, the storm is coming.
Right.
Literally and figuratively. And I don't think anyone else could make maybe George Harrison, right? Could like make something so literal into music. Right.
So at the last minute, they bring in gospel singer Mary Clayton, and it's like the last point. The producer of the song felt that that Gimme Shelter would really benefit from a female vocalist, so they called up Clayton in the middle of the night, I think, and she's pregnant. She's heavily pregnant, and she comes into the studio like still in her hair curlers, and she just knocks it out. In 2-ish takes. There's famously in Gimme Shelter a moment where her voice cracks. They decide to keep that in, and I think history is grateful that they did. I mean, it doesn't, so something so accidental is so symbolic for the song and what it's talking about. Like, her voice just comes apart for a minute, and it adds a sense of urgency, because literally it was very urgent getting this song finished.
Yeah. And you can even hear when her voice cracks in the deep background, Jagger going, yeah.
Yes. I know. I love that moment.
Makes it feel alive.
Yeah. However, recent history has been kinder to Mary Clayton. But
Yes.
but history was much less kind to Clayton. They first of all they spelled her name wrong in the credits. Her name is spelled Mary like Merry Christmas, and they spelled it Mary like the usual way.
In their defense, they also spell the name Gimme Shelter wrong on the record.
This is from The Guardian, and the day after the session with the Stones, Clayton, who was pregnant, suffered a miscarriage, and she attributes it to the strain that she put on her body pushing the heavy studio doors and reaching to hit those vocal peaks. She told The Guardian, "We lost a little girl. It took me years and years and years to get over that. You had all the success with Gimme Shelter, and you had the heartbreak with this song." And although she recorded her own version of the song for her 1970 studio album itself entitled Gimme Shelter, it took her a long time to listen to the Stones song because it was so closely associated with losing her child. She said, "It left a dark taste in my mouth. It was a rough time." Can you even imagine?
I can't imagine. And it also, like, I don't want to be the guy that's like, well, this incredible art was created in this moment of pain. But I think the reverse is true, that you could hear this absolute agony in her voice singing this song for whatever it is, right? She was a huge anti-racist advocate. She was heavily pregnant. It was the middle of the night. There's like a lot of things going on in the country and in her life. She's obviously a woman of color.
And being asked to sing on a Rolling Stones song. I mean, you want to get that right. You're gonna get up in the middle of the night.
And so there is a level of pain in her voice that is like extremely palpable, that, you know, isn't a good replacement for a child, that, or the death of a child doesn't excuse it, but like you definitely can hear it.
Yeah. Well, anyhow, during the 70s, Clayton did continue to amass credits. If anyone has seen 20 Feet from Stardom, the documentary that came out, I want to say like a decade ago, right?
Yeah, like 2013-ish.
Yeah, Mary Clayton features in 20 Feet from Stardom, which is about backup singers, and she sang backup on Ringo Starr's "Oh My," Carole King's "Smackwater Jack," and Joe Cocker's "Feeling All Right," and "Sweet Home Alabama." And she talks about her time with the Stones in 20 Feet from Stardom. So Mary Clayton, everyone. Gospel.
Yeah,
Mary
highly recommend that documentary. I think
Good
it also won Best Documentary Feature at the Oscars.
Yeah, I think you're right. That was a good one.
Yeah. So Scorsese and the Stones go way back. A long way back.
Yeah, so before The Departed, which was kind of seen as a return to form for Scorsese. It's funny, this is me showing my age, because I think The Aviator might have been my first Scorsese. I'd heard of Goodfellas. I just never saw it.
I probably saw Goodfellas on TV. I definitely saw Casino on TV in the 90s.
Yeah.
And I didn't care for it then. I don't care for it now.
I only know Joe Pesci as the wet bandit.
Yeah, Marv.
Marv, yes. But Scorsese later, 2 years after The Departed, he directs a 2008 concert film, Shine a Light, which follows the Rolling Stones' history and influence, and then their comeback tour in 2008.
Does not feature Gimme Shelter.
Yeah, well, wouldn't that be too on the nose?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, Mick Jagger and Scorsese were also producers and creative collaborators on the short-lived HBO series Vinyl, which I think we'd all be more than happy to forget about forever.
I love Bobby Cannavale.
I mean, who doesn't? We love Bobby Cannavale. That was a bad show. Although I did interview Gino Temple for that show, and that was, I like her very much.
I like Gino Temple.
I think she deserves all the success, and I'm happy that she has it. I think more than any time in her long career, because of
she's also in Black Mass, the Whitey Bulger movie.
Is she? Okay.
Yeah.
But she's, I know, a big deal she was in the last season of Fargo, which I have yet to watch. I hear it's very good. I'm slowly working my way through Fargo. And And what she's also in
Ted Lasso, classic.
Thank you. That's what Ted Lasso, which I have not gotten into because I don't care about soccer. I know it's not a soccer show. I just don't care. Okay.
It also has a really heavily featured Rolling Stones needle drop.
There you go.
Yeah.
Coming full circle. So as The Departed hit screens, the Stones had already been sampled numerous times, like in film in general. So it's like by no means even remotely original to use the Stones to soundtrack your movie. But Scorsese was one of the first to do it in general, using Jumpin' Jack Flash to intro Robert De Niro in 1973's Mean Streets. Scorsese has also used Memo from Turner in Goodfellas and I Can't Get No Satisfaction during Joe Pesci's funeral in Casino.
I think he also used the Devo version of I Can't Get No Satisfaction, which is very weird.
Yeah. Aviv, I wrote this in our notes because I wanted to make sure I asked you, what is your favorite or least favorite use of a Stones song in a movie or show?
I generally try not to peek at your notes before the show, and I'm very glad that I did because it gave me some time to think.
Okay, good.
My my first knee-jerk reaction when you said Rolling Stones needle drop was Ruby Tuesday in Royal Tenenbaums.
That is a good one. Good choice.
Yeah, and I also think the one that you mentioned, the Jumpin' Jack Flash to intro Robert De Niro's character in Mean Streets, is like extremely good. But Jumpin' Jack Flash is like one of my top Stones songs, so it like throws me in that direction a little bit more. But I think Let It Bleed, which is what has Gimme Shelter on it, and Let It Bleed, and I also think Jumpin' Jack Flash is like the best Stones record. It's so good.
Yeah. Well, let's get back to The Departed and additional crime films of Scorsese. Though it's expressing a common anti-war sentiment that was heavily prevalent in the late 60s, early 70s, and commenting on the overall instability and loss of innocence of the late 60s, Gimme Shelter is well placed in any environment that is teetering on the edge of chaos, such as organized crime, where things are going until they very much are not. And there were some lyrics within Gimme Shelter that spoke directly to young Colin, I thought. So, a storm is threatening my very life today. It speaks to young Colin, who is obviously very bright, but vulnerable and in need of positive reinforcement and support from a father figure who ends up being Frank, who uses him for his own ends under the guise of mentorship. And
like Frank is the storm, right?
Yes, Frank is the storm.
We think Frank is the shelter, but Frank is the storm.
Exactly. Yes. Perfect button. Yeah, button.
And you know the famous chorus, "War, children, it's just shot away. Rape, murder, it's just shot away," is ultimately, I think, what is like the impending danger of like Colin and Billy are both living on knife's edge of like as you say, they both keep narrowly missing each other, and they go around the wrong corner in Boston, and they got a gun in their face or a knife in their belly. And
the walls are closing, and I mean, at first, this is one of those pieces of media that shows something like machinery moving, seemingly like everything's kind of in its right place and moving, and the products are being made, and we're going, but it's unsustainable. And that instability is, as you said, it on like puts these characters just on a knife's edge until like I think even DiCaprio at some point is like, I'm going to be found out. It's just a matter of when.
Yeah, and even at the end when Colin is found out, and he's just like, I'm just glad it's over. Just like fucking do it already.
Yep. Yep.
But the interesting thing, and the reason that we are talking about The Departed and Gimme Shelter, is that it also kind of opens up a wider world of Scorsese's use of Gimme Shelter in other movies. So as we mentioned, this is the third time he's placed a song in one of his films, and there's some quote that I read that he like didn't even remember having used it before, but I kind of find that hard to believe. That sounds like a little impish to me. So Scorsese's first use of Gimme Shelter is in Goodfellas. And Goodfellas is also very famous for its Layla needle drop that I refuse to talk about because I hate Eric Clapton so much.
It's deserved. It's a deserved hatred.
He's a really bad person.
He is a bad person.
And Gimme Shelter is used in a voiceover montage of Ray Liotta's Henry Hill talking about his cocaine running business out of Pittsburgh. And just for reference, that musical montage and Gimme Shelter lasts about 1 minute and 5 seconds on screen. Then 5 years later in Casino, which feels to me in many ways like a Goodfellas follow-up, it uses a live version of Gimme Shelter over, you guessed it, a voiceover montage of this time both De Niro and Joe Pesci talking about all the murders that Joe Pesci's character Nicky is committing. And I shit you not, the montage is the exact same length, 1 minute and 5 seconds, even though the song is different. I feel like I'm going all Da Vinci Code on the show now.
Yeah, it's definitely a rabbit hole, and I don't blame you. I would probably be there to accept that the amount of Scorsese films that I've seen is I think pales in comparison to the amount.
I'm not like even a huge fan of his. I find his persona interesting, and I'll kind of get to that in a second. Of like, he has this reputation for being the mob movie guy when I don't know if that's necessarily warranted.
I mean, there's definitely something there. I think he's in a group of mob movie. People. Like I haven't seen Goodfellas, but I have seen both Godfathers.
Goodfellas. I think,
and all of The Sopranos more than once. So I appreciate the sophistication of the milieu.
Yeah, and I don't love Goodfellas as much as most men my age love Goodfellas. I think it is like okay, pretty good.
Right. It's not it's not for me. I enjoy like an unconventional mob movie like that shows dysfunction. Like I really liked The Wolf of Wall Street for another kind of organized crime.
I think you can put Scorsese's movies in like kind of 4 different categories, which is like mob movies about like unconventional organized crime, which you could lump in things like Wolf of Wall Street, The Killers of the Flower Moon, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
where it's like mob,
which I did really like. I recently saw that. Yeah,
mob adjacent. Yeah. And then there are like thrillers like Shutter Island and Cape Fear, and then there's like Kundun and The Last Temptation of Christ, and like just weird.
Yeah, I forgot about The Last Temptation.
But I think this also speaks to like what you were talking about of The Departed appearing to be a return to form with Scorsese, where like so his first era is like Taxi Driver, kind of thrillery era. Mean Streets is kind of about the mob, is definitely about the mob, and then like era 2 is like gangster movies, Goodfellas, Casino, and this feels like the beginning of era 3. Gangs of New York I feel like is an unconventional mobster movie, right? Because it's like gangs, but it's like in the 1800s, and then this feels like maybe the end of that era or the beginning of the next era, where we are returning to similar themes, different actors, because Pesci and De Niro have aged out, I guess, but similar musical cues, similar themes, and as we mentioned in The Departed, the third usage of Gimme Shelter is actually 2 usages of voiceover montage interrupted by a scene with different music. And then Gimme Shelter reappears later in the film, making the usage either 4 or 5, depending on how you count it, when basically the only woman character in the movie, Vera Farmiga's Madeline, a police psychologist who's dating Colin and treating and eventually sleeping with Billy, nests with Colin in a moment of domestic bliss. But this is not a montage. This is like a weird, very weirdly edited by the great Thelma Schoonmaker scene where they're like kind of nesting and but he's like, she like has this photo of herself as a child, and he's like, we're not hanging that up. I don't, but he's like joking around. And then Frank Costello calls, and he's pulled back into work. But it's so strange that Scorsese has this pattern of montage, voiceover information delivery, montage, Gimme Shelter, rinse, repeat. And then the last time that he uses it in his career, at least thus far, is this really kind of by the book A-B conversation scene. What the fuck? What the fuck is up with that, man?
You tell me.
I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about it because we've been planning this episode for a while, and I think it can be read so like Frank calls and interrupts the thing, so he's the storm that's coming, maybe. Or this is like this could also be kind of like reminiscent of the boy that Colin was in the diner before Frank got him and scooped him up. Like this is his opportunity for like a normal life, or maybe some combination of both things. But it's like a super interesting. On paper, nothing about the scene makes sense. The editing doesn't make sense. The music doesn't make sense. There's continuity errors all over the place. There's jump cuts. It's crazy, but it becomes the super memorable scene because of that. And therefore it's important to the movie in this like thematic way that I can't quite wrap my head around, even though I've seen this movie numerous times over the last 18 years.
I thought having only seen it once in the last week, I thought the young Vera Farmiga, right?
Farmiga?
Farmiga.
I'm not the guy who pronounces.
I don't want to pronounce it like
Formica, like the table.
Like the table, yeah, exactly. But I thought it was interesting the juxtaposition of how Matt Damon responds to it, like I don't really want to see it, haha. Don't hang it up because
this picture of you,
this picture of you, because I don't like. Presumably, it might make me think of my childhood, which I don't want. I only want to keep looking forward. I don't want to look back, and because if I do, then I'll start thinking more about the moral ambiguity of what I'm doing, and then when Leo DiCaprio. And then when Leonardo DiCaprio looks at it at the photo or the painting or whatever it is, he has a totally different reaction. He's like, "It's nice," and then he physically hangs it up as though looking back to his childhood might not be quite.
And that's the comfortably numb scene, right? That's like where they consummate their relationship, which is something that Colin can't do with Madeline.
Yeah, well, so it's like they suggest that Colin can't. Well, I mean, I assume that they consummated at some point. Because she ends up pregnant.
Well,
or
that's Billy's kid. I mean, that's Billy's kid.
I mean, we have to assume it's Billy's kid. Yeah.
But yeah, I think so. Right.
But for Colin to think that it could be his, that means that they'd have to have.
Exactly. At least once. But yeah, there is a lot to do. As you said, this is like a penis movie. Like, I think that's text, right? Like Colin is textually impotent and called gay a lot. Frank is also called gay a lot. And I think that there is this like, I'm not a scholarship in LGBTQ media, but I don't necessarily think that what the movie is saying is like these mobsters are gay and they can't be really who they are, so that's why they kill people, sort of thing. But I think it's like an interesting idea of masculinity, to the point that Costello asks Colin to meet him in a porno theater at one point, and like waves around a giant dildo, which a scene which was cut out in the India release of the movie.
Well, yeah. I have a theory that in any environment with that much concentrated maleness, there's going to be something homosexual happening. Like,
I think so.
Like, I'm not saying this is like an all the time type of thing, but I think that, like, okay, let's use the ultra Orthodox synagogue, for example. In Hasidic communities, boys are raised only around each other.
Sure.
And then when they come of age, there's like this undercurrent of a little bit of experimentation with each other, because women are, if they act, it doesn't really matter what they are predisposed to like. They just like, this is all that's around.
Yeah, it's availability, right?
Yeah, and so that's one environment, and then there's this. Okay, you'll probably know what I'm talking about because I don't remember the name. It might be Goodfellas. It's not Goodfellas. It might be Boondock Saints. But I remember, like, my ex was a film guy, and I remember he used to talk about like this mob movie where one guy was so masculine and male that he only slept with men.
I don't think that's Boondock, and that might be Boondock Saints actually. I think Willem Dafoe's character is gay in that. I don't really like that movie, so I've only seen it once about 20 years ago. That might be Boondock
but it's like he's so ultra masculine, and he makes a point to be that he will only sleep with men.
That's like that Simpsons joke. Ooh, you like girls? That's so gay. But I think that there's like it's an interesting discussion that the movie is having in a way that Casino and Goodfellas do not really tackle that.
And I mean, just Catholic repression.
And so I think
there's that.
And I think Costello like makes a handful of references of like priests diddling kids.
Yeah, doesn't he even like approach priests at a diner table and says something like, "Look, I'm not here to judge. You're sleeping with young boys," but he just like puts it right out there.
And that is interesting because that was, I mean, a thing that everyone quietly knew about for decades, but the Spotlight expose was only 5 years before this. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's still it's like around this is a post 9/11 film, as you mentioned. This is like also a post Spotlight Boston film. Right. And like the grooming of children for these nefarious purposes is like this undercurrent in this film. Super interesting.
Yeah.
So specifically, if we only look at the actual mob category of Scorsese's films, this is only his 4th out of 21 movies. Mean Streets, which, as we said, uses Jumpin' Jack Flash, and then the 2 previously mentioned, Goodfellas and Casino. So I'm starting to think of this as like a Scorsese mob trilogy, one that deals with the idea of corruptibility and loyalty and trust and ratting on your friends. Goodfellas famously ends with Henry Hill ratting on all of his friends and going into witness protection. And that's like amped up to 11 in The Departed, where basically everyone working for the state troopers is, with the exception of Mark Wahlberg, is corrupt, and everyone working for Costello is secretly a cop, as evidenced in that scene that we mentioned about 2 of Costello's men, David O'Hara and Mark Ralston, like saying, "Well, if you don't look at me, you're a cop," and they both turn out to be cops. And The Rock goes all the way up, literally, as the last shot of The Departed. In the last shot of The Departed, a computer-generated rat crawls across Collins Banister as it overlooks the State House in Boston.
Did you find that too obvious?
Yes. Yeah. I did 18 years ago, and I still do.
Yeah, I did too.
What is it about Gimme Shelter that unites these themes in this Gimme Shelter trilogy? As we said, notably, he hasn't used the tracks in the nearly 20 years since The Departed's release. And we have this like sense of doom and foreboding and walking on the knife's edge that I think is present in all 3 of these movies, and not so much in Mean Streets in the same way. Mean Streets is a very different style than these films. And so I feel like this is kind of the beginning, middle, and end of this era of Scorsese, which is like figuring out loyalty and friendship and the corruptibility of man.
Yeah, I stick to what I was saying earlier in the episode, where it's like this overlap of the Venn diagram is, I mean, it's constantly in flux. Yeah, but ultimately it's just a circle, with the exception of Mark Wahlberg.
And they were going to do a sequel because Infernal Affairs has 2 sequels. They were going to do a sequel to The Departed that basically followed Dignam because, spoilers, he's kind of the only character that lives. And that never materialized, and Mark Wahlberg doesn't do R-rated movies now because he's a total weirdo. But it doesn't seem like Martin Scorsese cares as much about Boston as The Departed fans do, because the film was primarily shot in New York.
Well, that makes sense. Oh my God. Because holy shit. While I was watching, I was like, that looks like New York.
I mean,
is that in Boston? Like, that looks like a New York block.
It is. I think it's like 70-30 New York and Boston.
Well, that validates a lot without doing the necessary research as to where precisely this movie was filmed. I was like, it doesn't look like Boston.
Yeah. A huge amount of it is in New York. And
well, Boston wanting to be New York.
I used to teach at a summer camp for like young filmmakers, and every year we went on the Boston movie tour, and so this was like 2007, 2008, 2009, and so they're all like, The Departed, and the tour guide was like, most of that's in New York, sorry.
I also don't want to go without saying that have you seen Martin Scorsese's granddaughter on TikTok?
Yes.
Very entertaining.
I am a big Francesca Scorsese
very entertaining content.
I don't think that's his granddaughter. I think that's his daughter.
Oh, it's his daughter? Okay. Yeah, you're probably right. It's been a minute since I think I saw them like together at the Oscars for Killers of the Flower Moon and was like, yay, then just forgot all about it.
She is his daughter.
Yeah.
Born in 1999 when he was.
That is, I mean, hey, if you can still do it.
If you can still do it.
Clearly they're bonding. That's all I mean.
Yes. Yeah. And they're in like a commercial together now for Wix, like, or Squarespace or something.
Yeah. Well, great.
Good for him.
Good for them. Bond with your daughter before you can't bond with her anymore.
He was 57 when he had her, which is old, but not that old.
That's the thing. I mean,
it's okay. You do know.
I know some people in my life who've not women, but men who've procreated at that age, and they seem very happy. So yeah, whatever makes your life a full circle.
Yeah, and I have very complicated relationships I have to take each of his movies like separately, because I really, really hated The Irishman and really, really loved The Killers of the Flower Moon. So I just have to. I never know what I'm going to get with him, which I think is how he likes it.
I do like that even though so many of his movies are very long, he justifies them with a really strong pacing.
Oh yeah, and that's Thelma.
That's something I think that's the editor. Yeah.
Yeah, Thelma Schoonmaker has been his editor since Raging Bull, since 1980. She's awesome, and she is one of the greatest to ever do it.
Cool. Yeah, because I think I put off seeing Killers of the Flower Moon because
it's so long.
I thought it was just going to be a slog, and that I needed to be in the right headspace to have the attention span, really. And then when it dropped on Apple TV Plus, that's when I sat down to watch it and was pretty riveted from start to finish, and was just like, I didn't expect to be that riveted.
And he gets really good performances out of people. Clearly, Leonardo DiCaprio and De Niro are both like his guys.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening. We are Aviv and Rachel. We're going to be off next week, just as a reminder to prepare.
Hey!
I got there eventually. For our big season 2 finale, which you can hear on July the 9th. And in the meantime, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. We're at the InSync Pod. Say hello to us there. We are edited by Katie Honor. Production coordinator Kyle Bosch, associate producer Lou Barron, social media producer Dale Stanfley, executive produced by Tommy West, original music by Taylor, the Boston Man Barefoot. InSync is a production of Gotham West Studios. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.